Racist cops shoot. Black Army colonel. Pentagon responds with brutal justice. The morning sun glinted off the polished hood of a dark gray BMW X5 as it cruised down Highway 85, heading south toward the quiet enclave of Silverwood Hills. Inside, Colonel Malcolm Reed, a 52-year-old Black Army strategist, sat behind the wheel, jazz humming from the speakers as the smooth saxophone notes matched the peaceful rhythm of the road. His face was relaxed, but his eyes carried a weight few could recognize, a quiet intensity sharpened by 30 years of military service. Today, though, he wasn't a colonel. He wasn't a tactician or a commanding presence in the Pentagon's inner war rooms. Today, he was just a son coming home. Silverwood Hills was one of those gated communities built to keep the chaos of the world at bay. Manicured lawns, luxury SUVs, white picket fences, and almost exclusively white families. Malcolm had grown up nearby but hadn't been back in months. His mother, Dorothy, was recovering from hip surgery, and he had promised her a visit as soon as he could get away. With his usual precision, he planned every detail, down to the strawberry peach cobbler from her favorite bakery that he'd pick up just before arriving. Malcolm had made a conscious decision not to wear anything that might give away his military rank. The Army ID stayed tucked behind his driver's license. No stars or medals, no uniform, just a black man in a good car, dressed in dark jeans, a navy polo, and a brown bomber jacket. He had done this deliberately. It was something he'd practiced for years in civilian life, blending in, not drawing attention. He didn't want respect out of rank. He wanted decency out of principle. As he turned off the highway onto the tree-lined roads of Silverwood Hills, Malcolm slowed to the posted 20 mph limit. He was aware of how he looked, how a black man behind the wheel of an out-of-state luxury vehicle could raise eyebrows in a place like this. But he kept his posture calm, his hands steady on the steering wheel. What he didn't see was the white Ford Explorer parked in the shade of a maple tree a few blocks ahead. Inside, Officer Scott Whitaker took a long sip of his gas station coffee and narrowed his eyes. He was in his mid-40s, thick-necked and heavier than his academy days, with a mouth that curved naturally into a sneer. Silverwood Hills was his territory, his comfort zone. And today, something about the BMW rolling past didn't sit right. "Look at him," Whitaker muttered under his breath. "Just cruising like he owns the place. Never seen him before." He picked up the radio but hesitated. No traffic violation, no call-in complaint. Just a gut feeling, the kind he never had to explain to anyone because it was never about the law. It was about who belonged. He pulled out onto the road, trailing the BMW like a predator stalking prey. The moment Malcolm turned onto Holly Ridge Drive, Whitaker flipped on his lights. Red and blue reflections danced across the pavement. Malcolm saw them in his rearview mirror and sighed. Not out of fear, but disappointment. "Here we go," he murmured. He signaled and pulled over with military precision, aligning the BMW perfectly along the curb under the shade of a sprawling sycamore. He turned off the engine, rolled the window halfway down, and placed his hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. Whitaker pulled up behind the car, letting his engine idle as he stared through his windshield. He ran the license plate, not stolen, not flagged. Still, he stepped out, one hand already resting on his holstered weapon. Malcolm watched him approach in the side mirror, noting his aggressive gait and the way his other hand twitched slightly at his side. "License and registration," the officer barked as he arrived at the window. No greeting. No explanation. No eye contact. "Good morning, officer," Malcolm replied calmly. "I don't believe I've committed a traffic violation. May I ask why I'm being stopped?" Whitaker leaned closer, peering in like he was inspecting a suspect. "You're not from around here. What are you doing in Silverwood Hills?" Malcolm kept his voice even, though the tension in his shoulders had started to build. "I'm visiting my mother. She lives on Sycamore Trail. I'm just bringing her something from the bakery down the road. Registration? Malcolm slowly reached over to the glove box, retrieved the documents, and passed them through the window. Whitaker barely glanced at them. Virginia plates. Long way from home, huh? I work in D.C., Malcolm said. I come down when I can. Whitaker handed the papers back, eyes narrowing. Step out of the car. Excuse me? Step out of the car now. I want to check the vehicle. It's standard procedure. It's not standard if there's no probable cause, Malcolm replied firmly. Officer, I've been polite and cooperative. There's no justification for a search. Whitaker's face tightened. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone like Malcolm. I set out. Malcolm exhaled through his nose. He knew what could happen. He also knew compliance didn't always guarantee safety, but staying in the car could escalate things further. Slowly, he unbuckled and stepped out, standing tall, calm. Now what? He asked. Whitaker stepped in close, too close. He was looking for something, fear, submission, guilt, but found none. Show me what's in your pockets. Officer, I'm going to call my attorney and record this interaction for my own protection. Malcolm reached into his inside jacket pocket, moving deliberately, his voice clear and composed. What the hell are you doing? Getting my phone. Don't move. I said don't move. Whitaker's voice cracked. His hand flew to his Glock. Time slowed. In one clean motion, Malcolm pulled the phone from his pocket and began to raise it. But before he could even unlock the screen, a single deafening crack split the silence. The bullet struck Malcolm square in the abdomen. He staggered back, eyes wide, breath leaving his lungs in a sharp gasp. The phone dropped from his hand, clattering against the concrete. He clutched his stomach, blood soaking through his shirt in seconds. His knees buckled, and he collapsed to the ground, struggling for breath. No gun, no threat, just a phone. Whitaker stood over him, chest heaving, gun still raised. His mind was a swirl of static. He told himself it was justified. That he had feared for his life. But even he didn't believe it. Within moments, a porch light flicked on from a house across the street. Then another. A teenager watching from a second-story window pressed record on their phone. In the distance, someone screamed. A neighbor dialed 911. And as Malcolm Reed's blood pooled beneath him on the pristine sidewalk of Silverwood Hills, the world began to shift. Not just because of the shooting, but because of who he was. And who would be coming for answers. Blood was still seeping into the cracks of the sidewalk as Officer Scott Whitaker stood frozen, the weight of his Glock suddenly unbearable in his hands. The gun hung limply at his side, smoke still faintly rising from the barrel. His breath came in shallow, uneven spurts, as if his own body had betrayed him. Across the street, porch lights flicked on like eyes awakening to a nightmare. Curtains rustled. A woman screamed. Someone shouted, "Did he shoot him?" Then came the sound of footsteps, tentative but urgent. It was all happening faster than Whitaker could process. He took a step back and stared at the man lying on the ground. The phone, just a phone, lay a foot from Malcolm's outstretched hand, its screen cracked and darkened. Whitaker's gaze darted to the blood pooling beneath the colonel's torso. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he realized there were things no body cam or witness statement could undo. He reached for his radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 114. Shots fired. Suspect was non-compliant, reached for a weapon. Repeat, suspect reached for a weapon. Requesting ambulance and immediate backup at 108 Holly Ridge Drive." He hesitated before releasing the button. That last part. Suspect reached for a weapon. He had to stick to it now. A door slammed behind him. He spun around to see a man in a hoodie running across the lawn with a cell phone pointed his way. Yo, I got it all, the man shouted. I got the whole thing. Whitaker blinked. He hadn't noticed anyone that close. The man ducked behind a tree, still filming. Put that phone away, he shouted. No way, man. You just shot that dude for pulling out a damn phone. You messed up big. Whitaker moved toward him but stopped halfway. The growing crowd, the phones, the lights. They were everywhere now. Panic settled into his gut like a stone. Inside a modest two-story house across the street, 14-year-old Aliyah Carter stood trembling behind a window with her phone still recording. Her mother, Rochelle, had already called 911. Someone needs to help him, Rochelle said through tears. He's not moving. 3 blocks away, Sergeant Linda Vega was wrapping up her shift paperwork when the call came through her radio. Shots fired in Silverwood Hills. Officer involved. Suspect down. Her hand tightened around the pen. Officer Whitaker. Her gut twisted. It wasn't the first time his name had come up in complaint reports. Excessive force. Profiling. But each time, nothing stuck. Nothing ever did. She grabbed her keys and radioed dispatch. This is Sergeant Vega. I'm heading to the scene. ETA 5 minutes. Meanwhile, paramedics arrived, sirens piercing the suburban calm. Malcolm still lay motionless, but shallow breaths told them he wasn't gone yet. The EMTs worked quickly, stabilizing, applying pressure, lifting him onto a stretcher as a trail of blood smeared the sidewalk. One of them noticed the phone nearby, now splattered with red. Is this his? He asked. Looks like it, the other replied. No sign of any weapon? None. Whitaker hovered nearby, arms crossed tightly over his chest. His voice cracked when he spoke. He reached for something. I thought it was a gun. I had to make a split-second decision. One of the EMTs, a black woman named Tamara, looked at him coldly. You didn't even check before you fired? Whitaker didn't answer. Malcolm was rushed into the back of the ambulance. Tamara climbed in with him, glancing one last time at Whitaker before they slammed the doors shut. As the vehicle pulled away, a wave of realization swept over the officer. Something was different this time. This wasn't going to disappear into paperwork. There were too many eyes, too many phones. Minutes later, Sergeant Vega arrived and was immediately struck by the atmosphere. The neighborhood wasn't known for drawing crowds, but people were gathered now, angry, confused, horrified. She spotted Whitaker near his cruiser, pale and twitchy. What the hell happened? She asked. He came out aggressive. Started reaching into his jacket. I told him to stop. I thought he had a gun. Where's the gun? Whitaker hesitated. I think he dropped it. Or maybe it was, I don't know, a phone? Vega's jaw tightened. You shot a man for pulling out a phone. He wasn't cooperating, okay? He got loud, he challenged me. She looked over at Officer Perez, already setting up yellow tape. Perez gestured toward the phone on the sidewalk. No weapon, Sarge. Only this. And the body cam? Was off, Whitaker said, trying to sound like he just realized it. Must have been a glitch. Vega didn't say anything, but her eyes narrowed. She knew that kind of glitch. It happened every time Whitaker thought he was in control. She turned to Perez. Start collecting witness footage. Especially from that kid across the street. Get statements from everyone who saw anything. I want everything logged, every minute, every angle. Back at Silverwood General, doctors worked frantically in the trauma bay. Malcolm had lost a dangerous amount of blood. His vitals were unstable. The bullet had torn through his liver and clipped an artery. He was barely hanging on. The lead surgeon, Dr. Rajan Mehta, glanced at the man's ID and froze. Lieutenant Colonel Malcolm A. Reed. He looked again to be sure. Military ID, DoD clearance. The man on his table wasn't just another civilian caught in a bad moment. "This guy's not just anybody," he murmured. "Call upstairs. Now." Within 10 minutes, the hospital administrator was on the line with the Department of Defense emergency liaison. Word traveled fast in those circles. Meanwhile, Sergeant Vega stood beside Whitaker's cruiser, staring at the crime scene, heart pounding. There was something off about the victim, something in the way he had spoken, the control in his voice, the discipline. It wasn't just that he was calm, it was trained calm. She had known soldiers. Malcolm Reed didn't sound like a random visitor. He sounded like someone with history. She pulled out her phone and called the watch commander. "We're going to need to ID this victim ASAP, and someone better be ready if this turns into a political mess. Something tells me this one's bigger than it looks." And she was right. Because back in Washington, D.C., inside the soundproof walls of the Pentagon, General Raymond Blake had just taken a call that froze him mid-sentence. "Sir, we believe one of our own was shot, outside of duty, in Silverwood Hills, North Carolina. The name is Colonel Malcolm Reed." And in that moment, the atmosphere inside one of America's most secure buildings turned electric. A man had been shot. But not just any man, a colonel. And now, the Pentagon was listening. The fluorescent lights above the emergency operating room buzzed softly, the only steady sound in a room filled with controlled chaos. Blood pressure monitors beeped erratically as surgeons worked with razor-sharp focus. Colonel Malcolm Reed lay on the table, his body pale and motionless, save for the frantic movements around him. Every second counted. "Scalpel," Dr. Mehta commanded. "We've got a liver laceration and a torn mesenteric artery." "He's crashing," someone shouted. "Clamp it," Mehta barked, sweat beading under his surgical cap. "Hang another unit. Keep the pressure up." For hours, the team fought to keep Malcolm alive. They managed to stop the bleeding, stabilize his vitals temporarily, and transfer him to intensive care. He was unconscious but breathing. Outside the OR, hospital security had already locked down the floor. A man with a DoD badge had arrived minutes earlier, accompanied by 2 suited agents who moved with an urgency that didn't match the usual protocol. It was clear now, this wasn't just a patient, this was an officer. A high-ranking one. "Do we have ID confirmation?" the taller agent asked. Dr. Mehta nodded. "Lieutenant Colonel Malcolm Anthony Reed. United States Army, stationed at the Pentagon." The agent's face didn't change, but his voice lowered. "This changes everything." Back in Silverwood Hills, the neighborhood buzzed with tension. Police had begun interviewing witnesses, but some were hesitant to speak. Others weren't. Rochelle Carter, who had called 911, had already shown her video to 2 separate officers. It clearly showed Malcolm stepping out of the car, calm, hands visible. "He didn't do anything wrong," Rochelle said. "He didn't raise his voice. He told the officer he was going to get his phone. Then he got shot." Sergeant Vega stood nearby, jaw clenched. "Can we have a copy of that video, ma'am?" Rochelle handed over her phone. "I already sent it to 3 people, and uploaded it to Dropbox. You're not burying this." Across the street, Elia Carter was sitting on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, her phone still in hand. "It was a phone," she whispered. That's all it was. Vega knew the story was crumbling fast. Whitaker's version, the one about a weapon, was already falling apart. And his body cam? Still malfunctioning, according to his report. Vega didn't believe it for a second. In the patrol car, Whitaker was trying to keep his composure. His phone vibrated on the console. It was a message from someone in the department. "Heard you were involved in a shooting. You good?" He stared at it, then quickly typed back. "I might be screwed." As the media caught wind of the incident, news trucks began circling the neighborhood like vultures. Local affiliates were first. But by the time it hit the 6 o'clock national broadcast, the headline had taken a sharp turn. Black Army Colonel shot by local cop in Silverwood Hills. The next morning, across the country, the story had made its way to every cable network and social feed. The hashtags were already trending. Justice for Colonel Reed. Shot while black. Silverwood cover-up. At the Pentagon, General Raymond Blake held a tight-lipped briefing with senior brass in a secured conference room. A photo of Colonel Reed appeared on a monitor. Decorated, loyal, with a service record cleaner than most officers twice his age. He was returning home to visit his mother. "That's it," Blake said, voice cold and sharp. "No weapon. No crime." Just a traffic stop that turned into a shooting. A junior intelligence officer leaned in. "Sir, with all due respect, this isn't the first time." "But it might be the loudest." Blake nodded grimly. "We're not just going to sit on our hands. I've already made calls to the governor's office, and we're preparing a statement. But unofficially, we're applying pressure. Every agency within our reach." By noon, the Pentagon had assigned a legal oversight team to monitor the investigation. Army Criminal Investigation Command, CID, was deployed to work alongside local internal affairs. A military liaison had been embedded with the DA's office. Things were moving fast, and in Silverwood, that pressure was already being felt. District Attorney Claire Monroe, sharp, no nonsense, and only 6 months into the job, sat at the head of a hastily called legal meeting. "You're telling me we have a body cam that went dark, multiple witness videos that contradict the officer's report, and no weapon at the scene?" "Yes, ma'am," her lead investigator replied. "Then I want full access to every second of Whitaker's patrol log that day. I want GPS. I want phone records. If he even took a bathroom break, I want to know when and why. And the victim? Any update." "Still unconscious, but alive. The Army's in full gear now. They sent a colonel to speak with the hospital board directly." Monroe leaned back in her chair, letting out a slow breath. Then this just went from local tragedy to national crisis. Across town, in a small hospital room protected by armed military police, Malcolm stirred for the first time. His eyes fluttered, then opened. He blinked against the light. "Colonel Reed." A nurse said gently, "Can you hear me?" He tried to speak but only managed a rasp. His throat burned. Pain radiated through his abdomen. "Don't try to talk. You're safe. You're in recovery. You've been through a lot." His eyes moved slowly, registering the unfamiliar ceiling, the machines, the uniformed figure just beyond the door. He knew immediately. This wasn't just recovery. It was lockdown. A moment later, a man stepped in, tall with silver hair and stern features. Colonel Jacob Langford, Army Legal Division. "Colonel Reed, it's good to see you awake. I won't ask much yet. Just know this. Washington is listening." "And you're not alone." Malcolm blinked slowly. Despite the pain, he nodded. Langford lowered his voice. "We've already started the investigation. But if you can recall anything at all, it could help expose the truth. They tried to frame this as justified force. That won't fly, not with your record. Not with what we've already found." Malcolm swallowed, throat raw. One word escaped his lips. "Phone." Langford nodded. "We have it. And Colonel, we're going to make sure the world knows what really happened." Outside, the storm was brewing. Inside, Malcolm Reed had survived. And now, he was ready to fight. 2 days after the shooting, the town of Silverwood no longer resembled itself. Protesters lined the sidewalks in front of City Hall, holding signs that read, "Justice for Malcolm, Black Lives Matter," and "Stop the cover-ups." Helicopters hovered overhead, broadcasting the unrest to every screen in America. Inside the Oak County District Attorney's office, Claire Monroe stared at her laptop, the video Rochelle Carter had submitted playing for the 10th time. The footage was damning. Crystal clear. No gun, no threat. Just a calm, dignified man reaching into his coat. And then a gunshot. She turned to Assistant DA Mason Carter, tapping her pen against the desk. The defense is going to try and spin this. Say it was split-second decision-making under pressure. Carter crossed his arms. That argument won't hold up with that video. Or with the others. The witness footage had poured in fast. 4 different angles. One from a jogger, another from a teen on a bike, and 2 from neighboring homes. All told the same story. No aggression. No warning, just fear turned lethal. And now, new pressure was mounting. That morning, Claire had received a personal call from Senator Harlan Caldwell, a retired general with deep ties to the Pentagon. "We're watching, Ms. Monroe," he had said. Not just for the sake of Colonel Reed's family, but for every soldier who wonders if their service means anything once they take the uniform off. His words echoed now, loud in her mind. She closed the laptop and stood. "Call a press conference. We're charging Officer Scott Whitaker with attempted murder. I want it public, and I want it clear." Meanwhile, at Silverwood General, Malcolm Reed sat up in bed for the first time. His body ached with every breath, but he was alert. Awake, watching. Colonel Langford stood by the window, arms folded. "The DA's filing attempted murder. I expect it to be upgraded once your medical report is complete. But Reed, they're going to come after your credibility." "You sure you're ready for this?" Malcolm looked up, face drawn but eyes steady. "I've taken gunfire in Afghanistan. I've negotiated in Baghdad. But none of it ever prepared me to be gunned down in my own country, for pulling out a phone." Langford nodded. "They're already questioning why you didn't identify yourself, why you didn't show your military ID." "Because I didn't want to," Malcolm said. "I didn't want to be saluted into safety. I wanted to see what the country really looks like when it thinks you're just another black man in a nice car." The silence hung heavy between them. Langford finally spoke. "You know this goes beyond you now." "I know," Malcolm replied. "That's why I won't let it go quiet." Across town, Officer Whitaker sat in a private meeting with his defense attorney, Dean McKay. The man was seasoned, gray-haired, cynical, and known for turning dirty cases inside out to find loopholes. "We have a problem," McKay said flatly. "Your version doesn't hold." Whitaker looked like he hadn't slept in days. His eyes were bloodshot, his voice hoarse. I panicked. I saw him reach, I thought. "You turned your body cam off. It malfunctioned. You've used that excuse before." "Twice," Whitaker snapped, "and I got cleared." McKay leaned in. "Not this time. Not with national attention. Not with the Pentagon involved." "They'll want blood, so what do I do? You need to stick to one thing. That you feared for your life. But understand this, Scott. There's a real chance you're going to jail. You may never wear a badge again." Whitaker's lip curled. He looked down at his trembling hands. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He had pulled over someone suspicious. That's all he saw. He didn't know, didn't care about ranks or medals. But now, the weight of the badge he once wore with pride was turning into a millstone around his neck. Back at the hospital, something unexpected occurred. Malcolm's daughter, Zaria, arrived from college. Tall, sharp, and carrying the same quiet fire her father was known for. She walked into his room, locked eyes with him, and broke into tears. "I thought I lost you," she said, gripping his hand tightly. "You didn't, baby. I'm right here." She wiped her face and looked toward Langford. "So what's the plan?" Langford raised a brow. We're building a federal case. Civil rights violations. We'll push the state to pursue murder once your father's condition is declared non-life-threatening. But we need more, Zaria finished. And I can help. She pulled out her laptop and opened a folder labeled Whitaker Complaints. She had spent 2 straight days digging through public records and old forums. He has 3 prior use-of-force complaints, 2 of them from black men. Both dismissed, but one of them posted details online. Stuff never made it into the report. Langford leaned over to look. This could blow his credibility apart in court, he said. And there's more, Zaria added. I found a video from 2019. He body-slammed a Latino teen during a traffic stop. The teen's family filed a suit, but it settled quietly. I've contacted them. They're willing to testify. Malcolm stared at his daughter, the pride in his eyes unmistakable. You're your mother's child, he said quietly. And mine. Langford smiled for the first time. We're not just reacting anymore. We're building a case that could change everything. The following morning, D.A. Monroe stood before a crowd of cameras outside the courthouse. Effective immediately, we are filing charges of attempted second-degree murder and civil rights violations against Officer Scott Whitaker, she declared. Based on the evidence and witness testimony, we believe the force used was not only excessive, but criminal. Questions erupted from reporters, but Monroe raised her hand. I want to be clear. This office is pursuing justice not because of pressure, not because of politics, but because a man was shot for simply existing while black, and we will not allow that to be excused. The image hit every major network before noon. Meanwhile, Whitaker watched from his couch, surrounded by silence, his face pale. His wife had taken the kids and gone to her mother's. His badge had been suspended. His life, as he knew it, was unraveling. He turned off the TV, but the sound of Monroe's voice still echoed in his head. For the first time, the man who once wielded power without consequence finally began to understand what it meant to be truly afraid. And Malcolm Reed? He was just getting started. The morning of the preliminary hearing was unusually cold for Silverwood. A gray sky hung low over the courthouse, where reporters clustered like bees around a hive. Military personnel, civil rights advocates, and everyday citizens packed the marble steps, waiting for the hearing that had already captured national attention. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with nervous energy. At the front sat District Attorney Claire Monroe and her team, flanked by boxes of evidence and binders stacked high. The opposing table held Scott Whitaker, his eyes hollow, hands clasped tightly. Beside him sat his lawyer, Dean McKay, stiff-faced and guarded. When Malcolm Reed walked through the doors, assisted by a cane, the room fell silent. He wore a dark suit, military ribbons neatly aligned on his chest. The scar from the gunshot wound peaked just above his collar. Behind him followed his daughter, Zaria, Colonel Langford, and 2 high-ranking officers from the Pentagon in full-dress uniform. Gasps and murmurs spread across the gallery. The room could feel it. This wasn't just a victim coming to testify. This was the army arriving in court. Judge Evelyn Hart, a sharp, composed black woman with a reputation for fairness, took the bench. She scanned the room before addressing the parties. Let's proceed. Claire Monroe rose first, confidence simmering just beneath her composed exterior. Your Honor, we are prepared to present compelling evidence of criminal misconduct, racially motivated aggression, and violation of civil rights in the shooting of Lieutenant Colonel Malcolm Reed by Officer Scott Whitaker. Today, we will establish probable cause that justifies moving forward to trial. The defense didn't respond yet. They knew the show was just beginning. The prosecution's first witness was Rochelle Carter, the neighbor who filmed the incident. She took the stand with steady nerves and calm clarity. I saw everything from my kitchen window, she said. He wasn't aggressive. He wasn't threatening. He told the officer he was going to get his phone. And then, boom, he was shot. You're sure you saw a phone? Monroe asked. Yes, I saw the shine of the screen. He held it out like this, she demonstrated, both hands steady. There was no weapon. Next came Officer Reggie Vega, who'd arrived at the scene minutes after the shooting. Whitaker's hands were shaking, Vega testified. He kept repeating that the man had reached into his jacket, but there was no weapon, just a phone lying on the pavement. Then came the twist Claire had been saving for last. She introduced a new witness, a young Latino man named Diego Moreno, dressed in a suit, his hands folded. Please state your name and your prior encounter with the defendant, she instructed. My name is Diego Moreno, and in 2019, Officer Whitaker slammed me to the ground during a traffic stop. I didn't resist. I just asked why he pulled me over. He said I was being aggressive, broke my wrist. Case was settled out of court. I was told to keep quiet, but I won't anymore. The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Even Whitaker's own attorney looked momentarily rattled, but it was Malcolm's turn on the stand that transformed the atmosphere. He walked slowly, leaning heavily on his cane. Zaria gave him a nod of support from the front row. As he sat, he looked directly at Whitaker, then at the judge. Ma'am, I served this country for over 25 years. I led troops overseas. I briefed senior officials at the Pentagon. I faced enemies, but I never expected to be shot in the gut by someone who's supposed to protect and serve in my own country. His voice never rose. It didn't have to. The weight behind every word landed with the force of a blow. I didn't tell him who I was because I shouldn't have to. I wanted to see how I would be treated as just another black man. And now I know. Claire gently asked, "What were you reaching for when the shot was fired?" "My phone. I was calling my attorney." "Did you threaten Officer Whitaker in any way?" "No. I stayed calm." I followed instructions, but that wasn't enough. The room was silent. Even the clicking cameras had stopped. McKay finally stood, his voice thin in comparison. "Colonel Reed, isn't it true that your hand moved quickly toward your jacket?" Malcolm blinked, unfazed. "No, it moved like this." He slowly mimicked the gesture, measured and deliberate. Nothing threatening, nothing sudden. Judge Hart leaned forward. "Thank you, Colonel. You may step down." When the final testimony concluded, Judge Hart called for a recess. Whitaker remained seated, jaw locked. McKay leaned in. "You're losing this. The evidence is stacking. You need to prepare for the worst." Whitaker didn't respond. He couldn't. His world was collapsing with every word spoken in that courtroom. And now, for the first time, it wasn't just about him being in the wrong. It was about the world finally watching. Outside, Claire Monroe stepped into the sea of microphones. "We have just completed the preliminary hearing in the case of the state versus Officer Scott Whitaker. Based on today's testimony, we will be moving forward to trial with charges of second-degree attempted murder and violation of civil rights under color of law." Reporters shouted questions. She paused, then added one last line that would loop on national TV for days. "Let this be clear. No uniform protects you from accountability when justice is at stake." Back inside, Whitaker sat motionless as the judge returned and delivered the final order. "Bail is denied. Officer Whitaker will remain in custody until the trial." The gavel struck once. And with it came the beginning of justice, not just for Malcolm Reed, but for every silent voice the system had ignored for too long. The trial of Officer Scott Whitaker opened on a crisp Monday morning under skies as heavy as the mood in Silverwood. A line of military officers in full uniform lined the front rows of the courtroom, joined by community activists, reporters, and Malcolm Reed's family. It didn't feel like a trial. It felt like history was holding its breath. Judge Evelyn Hart presided with firm control. Cameras weren't allowed in the courtroom, but the media presence outside was overwhelming. News vans, protest signs, and candlelight vigils had transformed the courthouse steps into a national stage. District Attorney Claire Monroe stood and addressed the jury, her voice steady. This is not just about one officer and one bullet. This is about a pattern. This is about what happens when someone believes they can act with impunity, when they believe the badge on their chest shields them from consequences. She paused, then turned toward Whitaker. Lieutenant Colonel Malcolm Reed did not die, but part of him was killed on that street. The dignity he carried, the uniform he wore, the country he defended, none of it protected him from hatred. The defense opened with a different tone. Dean McKay adjusted his tie, stepped forward, and began to frame his client as a man caught in a chaotic moment. Officer Whitaker is a father. A public servant. He made a tragic mistake under pressure, yes, but not murder. This was a misunderstanding, not malice. But the jury wasn't here for character defenses. They were here for the truth. First on the stand was Zaria Reed. She spoke of the nights she stayed awake, unsure if her father would survive. The panic, the anger, the silence between words when she visited him in the hospital. Her voice cracked, but she never cried. He wasn't just my dad, she said. He was a soldier, a man who'd survived war zones only to be nearly killed for reaching for a phone in his own neighborhood. Then came the forensic experts. The shot was fired from close range, one testified. No signs of struggle. No defensive wounds on Officer Whitaker. The trajectory suggests the victim was standing still, hands near his chest. The defense tried to poke holes. Stress response, perceived threat, split-second decision. But the facts piled up, and each piece painted a clearer picture. Then, a bombshell witness was introduced. Claire Monroe called Officer Lila Bennett to the stand, a former colleague of Whitaker's. She looked nervous, glancing at the badge pinned to her blazer. I worked with Scott for 6 years. At first I didn't want to believe any of this, but after what happened to Colonel Reed, I started looking back. She hesitated. He used to call it profiling by instinct. Said you can just tell by how someone looks if they're trouble. Most of us brushed it off. But there were complaints, small ones. They got buried. No one wanted to stir the pot. The courtroom stirred. Monroe leaned in. Did he ever express racist views? Bennett looked down, then nodded. Once, after a stop in a predominantly black neighborhood, he said, "These people don't belong in nice cars. When I see it, I assume it's stolen." I thought he was joking. I didn't report it, and I regret that. A quiet gasp rolled across the room. Outside, that quote was already being tweeted, headlined, and dissected. Then came the defense's turn. They called character witnesses. Whitaker's pastor, his sister, former co-workers. All spoke of a man dedicated to service, never violent before. But the contrast was stark. No amount of church attendance could erase the video footage, the testimony, or the underlying bias that boiled over that day. And then, unexpectedly, the prosecution played a 911 call from the day of the shooting. A neighbor had reported the incident live. "There's a man on the ground. He's not moving. The officer just shot him. Oh my God, I think he was just trying to take something out of his pocket." The voice of a panicked civilian, raw, unscripted. It landed like a punch to the gut. By midweek, it was time for Malcolm Reed himself to testify. He walked slower now, his cane tapping the floor with each step. But he stood tall, proud, and unshaken. "I'm not here as a victim," he said, looking each juror in the eye. "I'm here as proof that this country still has a long way to go. I served this nation with honor, but on that sidewalk I was treated like a threat, not because of what I did, but because of what I looked like." McKay stood to cross-examine. "Colonel Reed, Did you or did you not reach into your jacket during the stop? I did. Quickly? No, deliberately. I said I was calling my attorney. I wasn't reaching for a weapon. I wasn't hiding anything. But he didn't care. He didn't see a man. He saw a threat. And what if he genuinely thought you had a weapon? Then he should have followed procedure, asked questions, de-escalated, not shot me point blank without cause. McKay pressed harder. Couldn't it have been a tragic misunderstanding? Reed narrowed his eyes. A misunderstanding doesn't come with slurs. A misunderstanding doesn't come with a record of bias. This wasn't a mistake. It was a pattern. One I just happened to survive. The room was breathless. When he stepped down, even Judge Hart took a pause before continuing. Back in the hallway, Whitaker slumped in his chair, visibly shaken. For the first time, he wasn't the one holding power in the room. He looked at his attorney and whispered, voice hoarse. They hate me already. Doesn't matter what we say. McKay didn't respond. Because deep down, he knew this wasn't just about public opinion. It was about facts. And the facts weren't on their side. As court adjourned for the day, Zaria placed a hand on her father's shoulder. We're almost there, she said softly. Malcolm nodded. And I'm ready for the end. Not just for me. For all of us. The morning of the verdict, a heavy silence blanketed Silverwood. National media outlets had doubled their presence overnight. The courthouse was barricaded, security tighter than ever, but that didn't stop the crowd from gathering. Soldiers in uniform stood shoulder to shoulder with activists and citizens, black, white, brown, all waiting for justice to speak. Inside, the air was so thick you could feel it pressing against your skin. Every seat in courtroom 1 was filled. On the front row sat Eleanor Reed, her posture regal in black, Zaria gripping her hand. Beside them sat Colonel Langford and 2 generals from the Pentagon. No one spoke. They didn't have to. The weight of the moment said enough. Judge Evelyn Hart entered, her robe flowing as she sat and called the court to order. Her expression was unreadable. Jury, have you reached a verdict? The foreman, a middle-aged Latina woman, rose. Her voice trembled at first but steadied as she read from the paper in her hands. Yes, Your Honor, we have. On the count of attempted second-degree murder of Lieutenant Colonel Malcolm Reed, how do you find the defendant, Scott Whitaker? We find the defendant guilty. A beat passed. Then a collective gasp. Whitaker's jaw dropped. His knees buckled, and he dropped into his seat like gravity had betrayed him. His attorney leaned toward him, whispering something, but Whitaker didn't hear. He was staring at nothing, pale and frozen. Eleanor inhaled sharply but held back tears. Zaria closed her eyes, exhaling years of pain in a single breath. Colonel Langford nodded silently, a small flicker of something fierce burning behind his calm eyes. Judge Hart cleared her throat, her voice cutting through the murmurs. Thank you. Sentencing will proceed immediately. Claire Monroe stood, her face both solemn and unrelenting. Your Honor, the severity of this case cannot be overstated. A decorated U.S. Army officer was nearly killed in broad daylight by someone sworn to uphold the law. The attack was not only physical, but symbolic, a reminder of the deep rot of prejudice that still infects our institutions. She turned toward the defendant, then looked back at the judge. The people request the maximum sentence allowed under the law. Anything less sends the message that uniforms can still protect those who abuse their power. McKay rose slowly. His defense was thin now, just the fading skeleton of what used to be a solid wall. Your Honor, my client acknowledges the jury's decision, but we ask for leniency. Officer Whitaker has no prior criminal convictions. He is a father, a son, and until this moment had dedicated his life to public service. Malcolm Reed stood then. It wasn't planned. He just rose, as if some invisible force pulled him forward. "Your Honor, if I may." The room held its breath. Judge Hart gave a quiet nod. "I didn't ask to be shot. I didn't choose to become a symbol. But since that bullet entered my body, I've lived every day with the weight of what it means to survive injustice." He turned to Whitaker. "You didn't just try to kill me. You tried to erase everything I stood for. But I'm still here." Then back to the judge. "I'm not here asking for revenge. I'm asking for accountability. For all the men and women who can't speak anymore. For their families who never got to say goodbye. Let this verdict mean something." Judge Hart leaned back in her chair. Her gaze swept across the courtroom. Then she spoke. "Mr. Whitaker, the jury has found you guilty of attempted murder and violation of civil rights under the color of law. This court has reviewed all the evidence, the arguments, and the impact on the victim and the community." She paused, letting the silence land. "You are hereby sentenced to 25 years in state prison without the possibility of parole." A sharp intake of breath echoed across the gallery. Whitaker's mother, seated behind him, began sobbing. His attorney placed a hand on his shoulder, but the man looked like he'd left his body altogether. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at the floor, blinking rapidly. Outside, the news spread like wildfire. Crowds erupted into cheers, tears, and chants for justice. Military veterans saluted Malcolm as he exited the building, supported by Zaria. Journalists swarmed, but no one spoke until Eleanor stepped forward, a strength in her voice that felt like thunder. Today, justice was not perfect, but it was powerful. And my husband, my children's father, he stood tall through it all. Malcolm nodded silently beside her. As reporters fired questions, one asked, "What would you say to Officer Whitaker if you had the chance?" Malcolm didn't hesitate. "I already said it. I'm still here." The Pentagon released a statement within the hour. "We commend the judicial process for holding those accountable, regardless of uniform or title. The United States military will continue to stand against injustice, both abroad and at home." But it wasn't just military channels lighting up. Civil rights organizations, community leaders, and national figures were calling the case a landmark decision. Yet in the silence of his hotel room that night, Malcolm sat alone, staring at the reflection in the window. The weight didn't leave. The justice, though served, hadn't healed the wound. But he had survived, and sometimes survival was its own rebellion. Tomorrow he would return to Arlington. But tonight, he allowed himself one small truth. He had faced a system that tried to erase him, and he had made it look in the mirror. The months that followed the trial didn't bring peace right away. For Malcolm Reed, justice had been served, but justice didn't erase trauma. It didn't return sleepless nights or stop him from flinching at sudden sirens. The bullet had been removed, but the scar was deeper than the wound. It was a reminder. Still, something had changed. His story had caught fire across the country. News outlets debated the implications. Podcasts broke down every detail of the trial. Social media turned Malcolm Reed into a symbol, not of victimhood, but of resistance and honor. People finally saw the face of a man who had been nearly erased. Back in Silverwood, the police department went through a complete overhaul. Chief Daniels resigned under pressure. A federal review uncovered years of misconduct swept under the rug. Several other officers, once protected by silence, faced disciplinary action. Community members were invited into advisory roles. A new police oversight board was created with civilian leadership, led by, of all people, Officer Lila Bennett, the whistleblower who'd testified. And then came a twist no one saw coming. 3 weeks after sentencing, An anonymous leak hit the news. Internal memos revealed that Officer Whitaker had been previously investigated for misconduct, twice. Both cases had been buried by internal affairs. One involved the false arrest of a Latino teenager, the other, the excessive use of force against a homeless veteran. Both had been quietly closed. The outrage reignited. Why wasn't this exposed earlier? Who protected him? How many others were silenced? It wasn't just about Whitaker anymore. The public turned its eyes toward the system that enabled him. A congressional hearing was called. Malcolm Reed was invited to testify. He stood before the House Judiciary Committee, dressed in his army blues. The chamber was silent as he spoke. "I'm not here because I want revenge. I'm here because silence has cost us too much. I'm alive, but there are too many who aren't. If my case did anything, it forced us to look at the cracks in the system. And now that we see them, we don't get to look away." His words were replayed across every major news network that night. Following the hearing, a federal bill was introduced, the Reed Accountability Act. It aimed to increase transparency in local law enforcement and impose consequences for departments that failed to report misconduct. For the first time in years, bipartisan momentum formed around police reform. The bill passed the House. The Senate would be the next battleground. Back in Virginia, Malcolm returned to a quiet welcome at Fort Myer. Soldiers saluted him with more than just respect. They stood for what he represented. Eleanor greeted him at the gate with a soft smile. Zaria was already waiting in his office, sorting through letters and messages from across the country. "This one's from a high school class in Chicago," Zaria said, holding up a thick envelope. "They wrote essays about you." Malcolm laughed, something rare lately. "I hope they spelled my name right." He read through the letters that night. One from a 14-year-old named Deshawn stood out. "Dear Colonel Reed, you made me believe it's possible to wear this skin and still walk proud. Thank you for not letting them break you." He folded the letter slowly, closed his eyes, and let it sink in. Maybe that was the point. Maybe surviving was never just for himself. Maybe it was for every kid like Deshawn watching, wondering if dignity could win. The final chapter didn't end in a courtroom or a grave. It ended in the quiet promise of change. And still, questions remain. How many others are out there? How many stories haven't been told? How many truths are buried beneath badges and silence? Justice for Malcolm Reed was real, but it was just one victory in a larger war. As the sun set behind the Capitol dome, casting golden light over the monuments of power, Malcolm stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. Tourists passed by, unaware of the man who had survived both war zones and racial profiling. He didn't need recognition. He needed change. And now, so did the world. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it reminded you that justice is something we must all demand, then don't let it end here. Subscribe to our channel. Share this story. Let the name Malcolm Reed echo for those still waiting to be seen. Because tomorrow, another story will need your voice.